I was standing by the kitchen window when my phone rang. It was early evening, the kind where the sky turns that dull gray blue, and the world feels like it's holding its breath. My tea had already gone cold, untouched beside me, but I didn't notice until the ringing pulled me back. When I saw Daniel's name on the screen, something in my chest lifted, just a little. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound warmer than I felt. There was a pause on the other end. Not long, but long enough for me to notice. "Hey, Mom, listen, I wanted to tell you something about Christmas this year." Something about the way he said it made my fingers tighten around the phone. "We're keeping it small," he continued. "Just us. You know, immediate family. Immediate family." The words echoed in my head as if they didn't quite belong there. I stared at the reflection of myself in the window, faint, ghost-like against the dim sky outside. "Oh," I said quietly. "I see. It's nothing personal," he added quickly. "It's just been a stressful year. We need something simple. Quiet." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Of course. That makes sense. Thanks for understanding, Mom." "Understanding." "Yes," I said. "Take care, Daniel." The call ended, just like that. "No, we'll visit later." "No, we'll miss you." "No, I love you." The silence that followed didn't feel normal. It wasn't peaceful. It pressed in around me, heavy and unfamiliar, like a room that had suddenly shrunk. I stayed there for a long time, still holding the phone, listening to nothing. Then I slowly set it down. I turned back to the kitchen table. 2 cups sat there. One was mine. The other, well, I still set it out sometimes. Old habits don't leave easily. Not after years of sharing mornings, winters, conversations. It had been nearly 2 decades since Michael passed away. And yet, in moments like this, it felt like I had lost him all over again. I had always loved Christmas. Not in a casual way. Not in the decorate a little and call it a day way. No. For me, Christmas was something you built. I baked everything from scratch. Cookies, pies, cinnamon rolls before sunrise. I decorated the house myself, lights, garlands, ornaments collected over years of memories. I wrote cards by hand, even when my fingers ached. It was an obligation. It was love. At least, that's what I believed. This year, I had already prepared everything early. In November, I'd gone shopping, carefully choosing each gift. For Daniel, I picked a sleek leather planner. He liked things neat, structured. For his wife, Claire, I found a handmade ceramic diffuser I knew she'd admire. She once paused over something similar in a boutique window, and I remembered. For the kids, Lily and Noah, I spent the most time. Art supplies for Lily, who loved drawing. A science kit for Noah, who asked too many questions for his own good. Each item was wrapped neatly. Gold ribbon, clean edges. Their names written in my best handwriting. They were all sitting in the living room, waiting. For no one. I walked in there slowly, as if the room might look different somehow. It didn't. The tree stood in the corner, bare. I hadn't decorated it yet. I was waiting for Lily to place the star on top like she always did. Waiting for Noah to hang ornaments too low and laugh when I fixed them. Waiting for something that, apparently, wasn't coming. I sank into the armchair and pulled the blanket over my lap. Outside, the neighborhood was alive. Children ran through the snow, their laughter sharp and bright. A man across the street was setting up glowing reindeer on his lawn. Someone's music drifted faintly through the air, holiday songs I knew by heart. Everyone was preparing for something. Everyone except me. I thought I might cry, but I didn't. No tears came. Instead, something else settled inside me. Not sadness. Not quite anger. Something quieter. Colder. Clearer. The next morning, I woke up early out of habit. For years, mornings meant purpose, breakfast to make, lunches to pack, people to take care of. Now, there was nothing waiting. Still, my body moved on its own. I got up, put on my slippers, walked to the kitchen. I made tea, sat by the window, watched the world go on as if nothing had changed. But something had. I had hosted Christmas every year since I was 25. Through everything. Tijdfinals. Snowstorms. Illness. Even the year the oven broke halfway through dinner. It didn't matter. People came. Maybe late. Maybe distracted. Maybe not as grateful as they should have been. But they came. And now, I wasn't even included. I started thinking about the past. Daniel arriving early, always checking if I needed help, but never quite staying long enough to actually give it. Claire walking in with perfectly wrapped gifts that looked untouched by human hands. The kids rushing inside, asking about cookies, presents, decorations. It used to feel full. Loud. Alive. Now those memories felt distant, like something I had watched happen to someone else. I stood up and walked to the cabinet where I kept old photos. I pulled out a box and opened it carefully. Stacks of memories. Daniel as a boy. Laughing. Messy. Real. The kids when they were younger, still excited about the little things. Michael standing by the table, carving turkey, smiling like everything made sense. I flipped through them slowly. And then I noticed something. In almost every photo, I wasn't really there. Not properly. I was always in the background. Holding something. Carrying something. Fixing something. Smiling. But never sitting. Never part of the moment. I closed the box. My hands rested on it for a moment longer than necessary. And then I pushed it back into the cabinet. Maybe I hadn't built memories. Maybe I had just supported them, held them together, while everyone else lived inside them. I walked back to the living room and looked at the empty tree. For a moment, I considered decorating it anyway, finishing what I had started, pretending. But the thought didn't feel right. Not anymore. I stood there in the quiet house, staring at something that used to mean everything to me. And for the first time in years, a thought crossed my mind, clear and undeniable. Maybe I had been holding on to something that no longer existed. I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm, like my life had quietly shifted into something unfamiliar while everything around me stayed the same. I still woke up early, still made tea, still moved through the house as if someone might arrive at any moment, but no one did. The silence wasn't loud anymore. It was steady, settled, like it had chosen to stay. I found myself noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way the floor creaked in the hallway near the guest room. The faint ticking sound of the old clock in the living room. The way the light changed across the walls throughout the day. It was as if the house had been speaking all along, and I had just been too busy filling it with noise to listen. I walked into the guest room that morning without really planning to. It had always been their room. I kept it ready out of habit. Fresh sheets, folded blankets, a small vase by the window. Daniel once told me, years ago, "It's nice knowing we can stay anytime, Mom." I believed him. I held on to that sentence longer than I should have. But the truth was, they never stayed. Not once in recent years. The bed remained untouched, too perfect, like a display instead of a place meant for rest. I ran my hand across the blanket, smoothing a wrinkle that didn't need fixing, and realized something uncomfortable. I hadn't been preparing a room for them. I had been preserving an idea. A version of us that had quietly disappeared while I was still setting the table for it. Later that day, I found myself opening drawers I hadn't looked through in years. Old cards, drawings from the kids, little notes written in uneven handwriting. Love you, Grandma. Best cookies ever. I used to keep everything. I thought it mattered, that these small pieces proved something real, something lasting. But as I sat there on the floor, surrounded by fragments of affection, I began to see them differently. They weren't false. They just belonged to a time that no longer existed. And somehow, I had mistaken memory for continuity. I had assumed that because something was once true, it would remain that way. That love, once given, stayed in place like furniture in a room. But it doesn't. It moves. It changes. Sometimes it leaves. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went out. The department store was exactly as I remembered it. Bright lights, artificial garlands, the same music looping overhead. It should have felt comforting.
Familiar.
Instead, it felt like stepping into a scene I no longer belonged in. People moved around me with purpose, carrying bags, checking lists, smiling at things I could no longer see the same way. And yet, I picked up a basket. Old habits don't disappear just because your heart catches up. I walked through the aisle slowly, telling myself I didn't need anything, that I could leave at any moment. But then I stopped in front of the art supplies. Without thinking, I reached for a large set of markers, bright, organized, exactly the kind Lily would have loved. I held it in my hands for a moment longer than necessary. Then I placed it in the basket, not because I believed she would receive it, but because some part of me wasn't ready to stop choosing her. In the next aisle, I found a science kit, then something small and elegant for Claire, then something practical for Daniel. My basket filled the same way it always had, carefully, thoughtfully, automatically. I moved through the store like I had done for decades, my body remembering what my mind had already started to question. At the register, the cashier smiled at me. "Big Christmas this year?" she asked lightly. I hesitated. "No," I said after a moment. "Not this year." She nodded, as if that answer meant nothing at all. Sometimes small is better. I didn't respond. On the way home, the bags felt heavier than they should have. Not physically. Something else. Something harder to name. By the time I reached the house, my hands ached from holding them, but I didn't put them down right away. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking inside as if I were entering someone else's life. Then I stepped in. I placed everything on the table and sat down. Slowly, methodically, I began wrapping the gifts. The paper folded cleanly. The ribbons tied neatly. Names written with care. Daniel.
Claire.
Lily.
Noah.
I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I just did it. When I finished, I leaned back in the chair and looked at them. For boxes.
Perfect.
Unnecessary. For the first time, I didn't feel anticipation. I felt distance. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't painful in the way I expected. It was something quieter, like standing on the other side of a glass wall and realizing you had been knocking for years without noticing no one was listening. I sat there for a long time just looking, and then I did something I had never done before. I picked up Daniel's gift and carried it upstairs. There is a storage bin in the hallway closet, the one I used for wrapping supplies and decorations. I pulled it out, opened it, and placed the box inside. Then I went back for the others. One by one, I placed them in the bin.
Carefully.
Almost respectfully. Not as a punishment. Not as an act of anger. But as a decision. They didn't need these gifts. And maybe I didn't need to give them any more. I closed the lid. The sound was soft but final. I stood there for a moment, staring at the bin, and felt something shift inside me. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to notice. For years, I had believed that giving was what kept everything together. That as long as I showed up, prepared, remembered, cared, everything would stay connected. But standing there in the quiet hallway, I saw it clearly. I had been the only one holding that thread, and now I had let it go. Not because I stopped loving them, but because love, when it's one-sided, stops being connection. It becomes habit, and habits can be broken. I went back downstairs and sat in the living room. The tree still stood there, bare and silent. I turned on the lights. Just the lights. Nothing else. The room filled with a soft glow, gentle and steady. For the first time, the tree didn't look unfinished. It looked honest. And somehow so did I. The silence didn't feel accidental anymore. By the third day, it had structure, like something intentional, something I could walk around and examine instead of something pressing down on me. I stopped checking my phone every hour. I stopped glancing at the driveway when a car passed. I stopped expecting footsteps that weren't coming. It wasn't a dramatic decision, it was quieter than that. More like something inside me had simply settled into place. For years, I had lived in a kind of emotional anticipation, always slightly leaning forward, always preparing, always ready to respond. And now, with nothing coming toward me, I finally leaned back. That morning, I made breakfast properly for the first time in a while. Not out of routine, not out of obligation, just because I wanted to. I toasted bread, scrambled eggs, even sliced fruit, arranging everything on a plate as if it mattered. And it did matter, just not in the way I used to think. I sat at the table and actually tasted the food, noticing small things I would have ignored before. The warmth, the texture, the quiet satisfaction of doing something for myself without expecting anyone to notice. It felt unfamiliar, almost strange, but not wrong. Just new. After breakfast, I walked through the house slowly, not cleaning, not fixing, just looking. Really looking. The walls held years of effort, of care, of invisible labor that had once been directed outward. Every corner had been shaped by me, but I had rarely stopped to see it from the inside. I paused in the hallway and caught my reflection in the mirror. For a second, I didn't recognize the expression on my own face. It wasn't tired. It wasn't sad. It was neutral.
Clear.
As if something had been removed. I went into the living room and stood in front of the tree again. Still bare, still glowing softly with the lights I had turned on the night before. I tilted my head slightly, studying it. For years, that tree had been a centerpiece of activity, of voices, of movement and shared attention. Now it stood alone, and instead of feeling empty, it felt complete in its own way. It wasn't waiting. It wasn't expecting. It simply existed. And I realized slowly that I could do the same. Around midday, I decided to bake. Not out of tradition this time, not because it's what I always do, but because my hands wanted something to do. I pulled out the ingredients without thinking too much about it. Flour, sugar, butter. The familiar rhythm returned quickly, but it felt different. Lighter. There was no pressure attached to it, no imagined reactions, no silent hope that someone would appreciate it. It was just me, the motion, the process. The sound of the mixer filled the kitchen, steady and predictable. For once, I didn't try to fill that sound with music or background noise. I let it be what it was. As the first batch went into the oven, the scent slowly spread through the house. Warm, sweet, unmistakably familiar. It wrapped around me like memory, but this time, It didn't pull me backward. It stayed in the present. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes for a moment, just breathing it in. There was no audience for this. No one waiting. And somehow, that made it more real. When the cookies were done, I placed them on the tray and looked at them.
Perfect.
Golden. Unclaimed. I expected that familiar ache to return, that quiet disappointment that usually followed effort with no response. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something else. A question. What do I want to do with this? Not what should I do? Not what have I always done? But what do I actually want? I stood there for a long moment, considering. Then I reached for a tin. Not one of the labeled ones I used every year. Just a simple, empty container. I filled it slowly, placing each cookie with care, not out of habit this time, but intention. When I finished, I closed the lid and held it in my hands. And then, without overthinking it, I grabbed my coat. The air outside was sharp, clean, immediate. It woke something up in me the second I stepped out. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked down the street, not entirely sure where I was going at first. But then I found myself turning toward the small blue house a couple doors down. I had noticed them months ago. A young woman and her daughter. Quiet.
Polite.
Always a little cautious. We had exchanged a few words here and there. Nothing deep, nothing significant. But enough to recognize each other. I stood at their door for a second, the tin still in my hands, and hesitated. Not because I was unsure, but because this felt different. There was no obligation behind it. No expectation of return. Just a simple choice. I knocked. A moment passed. Then the door opened. The woman looked surprised at first, then softened when she recognized me. "Hi," she said gently. "Hello," I replied, holding out the tin. "I made too many. I thought you might like some." She blinked, clearly not expecting it. Then she smiled, small but genuine. "That's really kind of you." Her daughter appeared behind her, peeking curiously at the tin. "Are those cookies?" she asked. I smiled. "They are." The girl stepped forward immediately, her eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. "Can I try one?" Her mother laughed softly. "Maybe we should invite her in first." I hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then I nodded. "All right." The house was warm, slightly cluttered, full of small signs of real life. Shoes by the door, a blanket draped over the couch, a faint smell of something sweet in the air. It wasn't perfect. It felt alive. The girl opened the tin before even sitting down and took a bite, her expression instantly changing. "These are really good," she said, mouth half full. I laughed quietly. "Thank you." Her mother watched the interaction, something thoughtful in her eyes. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. "I know," I replied. "And I meant it." I stayed for a short while. Not long enough to feel like I was intruding, but long enough to feel present. The conversation was simple.
Easy.
No expectations, no history weighing it down. Just a moment shared between people who happened to be in the same place at the same time. When I left, the tin was empty, and my hands felt lighter. As I walked back home, something inside me shifted again. Not dramatically, but enough. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking back to an empty house. I was walking back to my house. And there was a difference. When I stepped inside, the silence was still there. But it didn't feel like something missing anymore. It felt like space. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible inside it. I felt present. Something changed after that day, and it wasn't loud or dramatic the way people expect change to be. There was no sudden breakthrough, no tears, No moment where everything inside me cracked open and rebuilt itself.
It was quieter than that.
More precise, like a decision that didn't need to announce itself to be real. I stopped waking up with that invisible weight in my chest, the one that used to sit there every morning, reminding me of what I needed to do, who I needed to call, what I needed to prepare. That list, constant, endless, was gone. And in its place, there was something unfamiliar.
Space.
At first, I didn't know what to do with it. I kept reaching for old habits, almost automatically, like my hands were trying to return to something my mind had already outgrown. I would glance at my phone, thinking maybe I should check in, maybe I should send a message, maybe I should make sure everything was fine. But every time that thought appeared, another one followed it, clearer, steadier. They know where I am. That realization didn't come with bitterness. It came with clarity. For years, I had believed that connection needed constant maintenance, that if I didn't initiate, nothing would happen. And I was right. Nothing would happen. But what I hadn't understood before was what that actually meant. It didn't mean I wasn't doing enough. It meant I was the only one doing anything at all. That kind of truth doesn't explode, it settles. It rearranges things quietly until you can't ignore it anymore. And once you see it clearly, you can't go back to pretending. The house began to feel different too. Not because anything physically changed, but because I stopped treating it like a waiting room. For years, every space in it had been prepared for someone else. Extra towels folded just in case. Chairs positioned for conversations that never lasted long enough. Shelves filled with things I thought others might need or appreciate. I had designed my own home around the possibility of being visited. And now, with that possibility gone, I started to see it for what it actually was.
Meaning.
That afternoon, I did something small, but it felt significant. I walked into the guest room and sat down on the bed.
Not to check it.
Not to fix anything. Just to sit. The mattress dipped slightly under my weight, unfamiliar in a way that made me pause. I looked around the room. The neat curtains, the untouched dresser, the careful arrangement that had never been used. And for the first time, I allowed myself to admit what I had avoided for years. This room had never been meant for them. Not really. It had been built out of hope, not reality. And hope, when it isn't shared, turns into something else. Something quieter. Something that looks like patience, but feels like waiting. I stood up slowly and opened the closet. Inside were extra blankets, neatly stacked, along with a small overnight bag I had once packed, just in case. I stared at it for a moment, then reached in and pulled it out. The zipper sounded louder than it should have in the quiet room. I opened it. Inside was a folded nightgown, a toothbrush still in its packaging, a pair of slippers I had never worn. I had prepared myself for a version of life that never arrived. And somehow, I had left that preparation untouched, as if acknowledging it would make the truth too obvious. I closed the bag and set it aside. Then, without overthinking it, I began changing the room. Not completely. Not dramatically. Just enough. I removed the extra pillows, opened the curtains wider, took one of the blankets and draped it over the chair near the window. I didn't do it with a plan in mind. I just followed what felt right. And slowly, the room stopped feeling like a placeholder and started feeling like a space again. Not for guests. For presence. When I finished, I stepped back and looked at it. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that mattered more. The rest of the day unfolded in the same quiet way.
No urgency.
No schedule. Just small choices, one after another. I made lunch when I felt hungry, not when I thought I should. I sat by the window and watched the street without wondering who might arrive. I picked up a book I hadn't touched in years and read a few pages, not because I needed distraction, but because I wanted to see if I still could. And I could. Slowly at first, then more easily. By evening, the light in the house softened, turning everything slightly golden. I turned on the tree again, just the lights, and sat across from it. It had become something of a quiet companion, not in a sentimental way, but in a steady, grounding one. It didn't demand anything. It didn't represent expectations anymore. It just existed. And somehow that was enough. I thought about calling Daniel. The thought came and stayed longer than usual. Not out of need, not out of habit, but curiosity. What would I even say? That I missed him? That I was hurt? That something had changed? None of those felt right. Not because they weren't true, but because they no longer felt necessary. There was a time when I believed everything needed to be explained, that silence had to be filled, that distance had to be addressed immediately before it grew too large. But now, sitting there in the quiet glow of the room, I realized something I hadn't fully understood before. Not every silence needs to be broken. Some silences reveal things words would only blur. So I didn't call. And for the first time, it didn't feel like I was holding back. It felt like I was choosing not to reach. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Later that night, I walked through the house one more time before going to bed. Not checking, not preparing, just noticing. The kitchen was clean, but not staged. The living room was quiet, but not empty. The guest room, no, not the guest room anymore, just a room, felt settled. Even the hallway seemed different, like the air itself had shifted. I paused by the mirror again. This time, I recognized the person looking back at me. Not because she looked different, but because she wasn't waiting. That was the difference. For years, I had defined myself through what I gave, what I prepared, what I held together. I had measured my place in other people's lives by how needed I was. And when that need quietly disappeared, I didn't know where that left me. But now, standing there in the stillness, I understood something simple and undeniable. I still existed, even without being needed. And more than that, I was still whole. I turned off the lights and went to bed without checking my phone. No messages. No missed calls.
No explanations.
Just quiet. And for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like something I had to endure. It felt like something I had chosen. By the time Christmas morning arrived, I already knew it wouldn't feel the way it used to. There was no illusion left to protect, no expectation waiting quietly in the background. I woke up slowly, not because I was tired, but because there was nowhere I needed to be. No schedule.
No routine.
No footsteps in the hallway. No voices calling out from another room. Just the soft hum of the house settling into the day. For a moment, I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet as if it had something to say. It didn't. And somehow, that was the most honest thing about it. I made tea and carried it into the living room, sitting across from the tree. It still stood bare, wrapped only in light. And I realized something as I looked at it. This was the first Christmas where nothing about the day was performative. There were no roles to play, no expectations to meet, no invisible checklist guiding every movement. There was only me exactly as I was, in a space that no longer required me to prove anything. That realization didn't feel sad. It felt clean, like stepping into fresh air after being in a crowded room for too long. After breakfast, I walked to the small cabinet in the hallway where I kept important documents. I hadn't planned to open it that day, but something about the stillness made it feel like the right moment. I pulled out a folder labeled in my own handwriting, one I hadn't looked at in quite some time. Inside were records, years of them. Receipts, copies of checks, notes written in the margins of things I thought I might need to remember. As I flipped through them, I began to see a pattern I had never fully acknowledged before. Not because it was hidden, but because I had chosen not to look at it directly. There were payments I had made when Daniel needed help. Contributions to things that were never really mine to carry. Quiet support, given without question, without condition. At the time, I told myself it was what family does. And maybe that's true. But what I hadn't asked myself then, what I hadn't allowed myself to consider, was whether that support had ever been mutual. Whether it had ever been seen as something more than expected. I sat there for a long time, the folder open in my lap, the past laid out in neat rows of paper and ink. And then, without any rush or hesitation, I closed it. Not out of denial, but out of decision. I stood up, walked to the phone, and dialed the bank. The line rang twice before someone answered, his voice cheerful, automatic, practiced. "Good morning. How can I assist you today?" "My name is Emma Carter," I said calmly. "I'd like to make some changes to my accounts." There was nothing emotional in my tone. No edge, no hesitation. Just clarity. We went through the usual steps: verification, confirmation, small pauses while he typed. I answered everything steadily, my voice even, my mind focused. And then I said it. "I want to remove all shared access and permissions connected to my son." There was a brief pause on the other end. Not long, just enough to acknowledge that what I had said carried weight. "Of course," he replied. "I'll take care of that right away. Would you also like to revoke any previous authorizations?" "Yes," I said. Another pause. More typing. "It's done. You'll need to sign a final confirmation after the holiday, but the changes are already in effect." "Thank you. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" I thought for a moment. Then I answered, "Yes." I gave him instructions for opening a new account. Not large, not dramatic, just something intentional, something directed differently than before. When the call ended, I stood there for a second, the phone still in my hand. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel anger. I felt alignment. For years, my actions had been out of sync with what I actually experienced. I had continued to give in ways that no longer reflected reality. Not because I was forced to, but because I hadn't allowed myself to stop. And now, for the first time, my actions matched my understanding. That was the shift. I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I went back into the living room and sat down again, letting the quiet settle around me. The tree lights flickered softly, steady and unchanged. Outside, I could hear distant movement, cars passing, voices carried faintly through the cold air. Life was happening, just not here. And that was okay. Around midday, I decided to step outside. The air was crisp, sharp enough to make me inhale a little deeper than usual. Snow covered the ground in a thin, even layer, untouched in places, marked by footsteps in others. I walked slowly, not heading anywhere in particular, just moving. The neighborhood felt different on Christmas, quieter, more contained, like everyone had retreated into their own spaces. As I passed the small blue house, I noticed movement in the window. A small figure, her. She saw me almost immediately and ran toward the door. A moment later, it opened. "Hi," she said, her voice bright, immediate. "Hello," I replied, smiling without thinking about it. "Mom said to say thank you again," she added quickly. "The cookies are gone." I laughed softly. "That's a good sign." She nodded seriously, then hesitated for a second. "Do you want to come in?" The question was simple. No pressure.
No expectation.
Just an opening. I considered it briefly. Then I shook my head, gently. Not today, I said. But thank you. She seemed to accept that easily. Okay. I paused, then added, Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, she said, already stepping back inside. The door closed and I continued walking. There was something about that interaction that stayed with me, not because it was significant in a traditional sense, but because it was honest. There was no history complicating it, no expectations attached to it. Just a moment, offered and received exactly as it was. When I returned home, the house felt the same, but I didn't. I took off my coat, set it aside, and walked back into the living room. The tree lights were still on, casting soft reflections against the walls. I sat down and looked at them, not searching for meaning, not comparing this moment to any other year. Just seeing it, just being in it. And then, slowly, a thought formed, clear, steady, undeniable. This was the line. Not something I had drawn in anger, not something I had declared out loud, but something I had stepped into fully. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't preparing for something that might not come. I wasn't measuring my worth by how much I gave or how often I reached out. I had stopped. And in stopping, I had changed everything. The day passed quietly after that.
No interruptions.
No calls. No messages. Just time moving forward, steady and uninterrupted. And for the first time, I didn't fill that time with attempts to reach outward. I stayed where I was, present, whole, enough. It didn't take long for the silence to travel beyond my house. For years, I had been the one who filled every gap, calls, messages, reminders, small gestures that kept everything appearing connected. When that stopped, it created a space that couldn't be ignored. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. And somewhere on the other side of that silence, Daniel noticed. I didn't see it happen, of course. I wasn't there when he opened his banking app or when he realized something had changed. I wasn't standing in his kitchen when confusion turned into irritation, or when irritation slowly shifted into something harder to name. But I knew him well enough to imagine the sequence. First, dismissal, assuming it was a mistake, a delay, something temporary. Then the second look, slower this time. Then the realization that this wasn't an error. It was a decision. The first time he called, I was sitting by the window. I saw his name light up on the screen, bright and familiar, and for a moment, just a moment, something instinctive moved inside me. Not hope, not quite, more like recognition, a reflex built over years. My hand hovered slightly, not reaching, just acknowledging the movement. I didn't answer. The phone stopped ringing after a few seconds. Then it buzzed again.
And again.
I let it, not out of spite, not as a form of punishment, but because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Answering would have been returning to the same pattern, the same imbalance, the same quiet erasure of myself. And I wasn't going back to that. A message followed. Hey, Mom, I think something's wrong with the bank account. Can you call me? I read it once. Then I placed the phone face down on the table. The wording didn't surprise me. It wasn't, how are you? It wasn't Merry Christmas. It wasn't even I miss you. It was practical.
Direct.
Focused on what had changed, not why. And that told me everything I needed to know. Time passed. Another message. Can you please call me when you get this? I didn't respond. I made tea instead.
Sat down.
Watched the light shift across the room. For the first time, his urgency wasn't mine. And that distinction felt important. Later that day, he called again. This time, he left a voicemail. I didn't listen to it right away. I let it sit there, waiting, the way I had waited so many times before. Not out of calculation, but because I no longer felt the need to respond immediately to everything that reached for me. When I finally pressed play, his voice filled the room, controlled, slightly strained, trying to sound calm. Hey, I don't know what's going on, but something's definitely off. I can't access the account anymore. If you change something, just let me know. I just need to understand what's happening. I listened to the whole message without interruption. Then I set the phone down again. There was no anger in me as I sat there.
No satisfaction.
Just clarity. He didn't need to understand what was happening. He already did. He just hadn't expected it to happen this way, quietly, without warning, without discussion. But that was exactly how everything else had happened too, wasn't it? The distance, the exclusion, the shift in our relationship, it hadn't been announced. It had unfolded slowly, quietly, without explanation. And I had adapted to it without question. Now, I was the one who had changed something. And suddenly, it required an explanation. That contrast didn't make me bitter. It made me certain. Evening came, and with it another call. This time, his voice sounded different. Less controlled. More tired. Mom, I don't really know what to say here. This doesn't feel like you. If something's wrong, you could have told me. You don't have to do all this.
He paused.
I just thought. I don't know. I thought everything was fine. The message ended there. And I sat with that sentence for a long time. I thought everything was fine. Of course he did. Because for him, it had been. That was the part that took me years to understand. Silence doesn't feel the same on both sides. For the person being ignored, it's heavy, noticeable, present in every moment. For the person doing the ignoring, it barely registers. It becomes background, normal,
easy,
until it stops. And then suddenly, it's a problem. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street. The sky had darkened, the snow reflecting faint light from nearby houses. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear laughter, faint but unmistakable. Life continuing, uninterrupted. I pressed my hand lightly against the glass, feeling the cold through it. For years, I had adjusted myself to fit into someone else's version of connection. I had made space, filled gaps, compensated for what was missing without ever naming it. And because I never named it, it was never acknowledged. Now, without saying a word, I had named it, not through confrontation, through absence. And that absence was louder than anything I could have said. The next morning, there were no new messages, no missed calls, just quiet. But this quiet was different from the one before. It wasn't empty. It carried something with it, awareness, maybe, or consequence. Something had shifted, and even without direct communication, I could feel it settling into place. I moved through the house as I had the day before, steady, unhurried, present. The changes I had made, small as they were, felt permanent now. Not temporary adjustments, not reactions, but decisions that had already taken root. I no longer checked my phone out of habit. I no longer waited for something to break the silence. I no longer needed confirmation that I existed in someone else's life, because I existed in my own. That afternoon, I sat at the table with a notebook in front of me. It wasn't something I had planned, just something that felt right in the moment. I opened it to a blank page and held the pen for a second, unsure of what I intended to write. Then slowly I began. Not a letter, not a message, just names. People who had shown up, not consistently, not perfectly, but genuinely. The woman down the street, the child who knocked on my door, a few old friends I hadn't spoken to in a while, but who had never made me feel like I was an obligation. It wasn't a long list, but it was real. When I finished, I looked at the page for a moment, then closed the notebook. For years, I had focused on maintaining connections that required effort to sustain, but gave little in return. I had overlooked the ones that existed without pressure, without expectation, simply because they were quieter. Now I was paying attention to those, not out of necessity, out of choice. That evening, I turned on the tree lights again and sat in the dim glow, the room calm and still around me. I thought about everything that had happened, not as a series of events, but as a gradual unfolding. Nothing had been sudden. Nothing had been forced. It had all been there, waiting to be seen. And now it was. My phone remained on the table.
Silent.
I didn't reach for it. I didn't wonder if it would ring. I didn't need it to, because the silence had already said everything. And for the first time, I had answered it. New Year's Eve arrived without announcement, without build-up, without any of the usual noise that used to surround it. There were no invitations, no last-minute calls, no plans to coordinate or adjust around someone else's schedule. The day simply unfolded, steady and quiet, like every day had begun to do. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to begin. I was already inside it. That morning, I woke up before the sun had fully risen. The light outside was soft, pale, almost hesitant. I lay there for a moment, not rushing to get up, not running through a mental list of things to do. There was no list, no pressure, just a simple awareness that I was awake and that the day belonged entirely to me. That realization still felt new, but no longer unfamiliar. It settled into me more easily now, like something I had finally allowed instead of something I was still learning to accept. I got up slowly, wrapped myself in a warm sweater, and walked into the kitchen. The house greeted me the way it had been for days now, quiet, but not empty. There's a difference, and once you feel it, you can't confuse the two again. I made tea, the same way I always had, but without the sense that it was just part of a routine leading to something else. This was the moment. There was nothing waiting beyond it that needed my attention more. I carried the cup into the living room and sat across from the tree. It was still bare except for the lights, which had become enough in a way decorations never were. I used to think fullness meant meaning, that more effort, more detail, more visible signs of celebration made something more real. But now, looking at that simple tree glowing quietly in the corner, I understood something differently. Meaning doesn't come from how much you add. Sometimes it comes from what you stop trying to force. I thought about the past year, not as a series of events, but as a pattern I could finally see clearly. All the ways I had stretched myself to maintain something that wasn't balanced. All the moments I had dismissed my own discomfort because I believed that keeping things together mattered more than how it felt to be inside them. I hadn't been weak. I hadn't been blind. I had been consistent,
Loyal.
patient. But those qualities, when they're not met with the same energy, slowly turn into something else. Something heavier. Something that looks like strength from the outside, but feels like exhaustion from within. And then, without warning, that pattern had broken. Not because someone else changed, but because I did. I stopped participating in it. And everything after that followed naturally. Around midday, I decided to go for a walk. The air was cold, sharper than it had been in the days before, but it didn't bother me. If anything, it made me feel more present, more aware of each step, each breath. The neighborhood was quieter than usual, people either inside preparing for the evening or already gone to wherever they had chosen to celebrate. I walked slowly, not heading anywhere in particular, just moving through the space I had lived in for years but was only now truly noticing. As I passed the small blue house, I saw movement again. The girl noticed me almost immediately, pressing her hands against the window before disappearing and reappearing at the door a second later. "Hi," she called out, stepping onto the porch. "Hello," I replied, stopping near the edge of the walkway. "Mom said we're making hot chocolate later," she said quickly. "With marshmallows. Do you want to come?" The invitation was simple, the same way it had been before.
No expectation. No obligación.
Just an open door. I smiled. "Thank you," I said gently. "Maybe another time." She nodded, accepting the answer without hesitation. "Okay. Happy New Year." "Happy New Year," I echoed. I continued walking, and as I did, I thought about how different that moment felt compared to the ones I used to have with my own family. There was no tension in it, no hidden meaning, no need to read between the lines or wonder what wasn't being said. It was clear, complete, and enough exactly as it was. By the time I returned home, the sky had begun to darken, the soft gray shifting into deeper shades of blue. I took off my coat, set it aside, and moved through the house with a sense of calm that no longer felt temporary. This wasn't something fragile that might disappear the next time the phone rang or a message appeared. It was steady, chosen.
Mine.
I didn't check my phone. I hadn't in hours, and I didn't feel the need to. Instead, I went into the kitchen and prepared something simple to eat. Nothing elaborate, nothing symbolic, just food. I ate at the table, slowly, without distraction, without the background noise I used to rely on to fill the space. The quiet remained, but it no longer asked anything of me. It simply existed, and I existed within it. Afterward, I returned to the living room and lit a candle, placing it near the window. The flame flickered gently, reflecting in the glass alongside the lights of the tree. Outside, I could see distant flashes of early fireworks, faint and scattered, reminders that somewhere, people were counting down to something. But I wasn't waiting for midnight. I wasn't waiting for a moment to mark a change, because the change had already happened, and it hadn't needed a countdown. I sat down and allowed myself to think about Daniel again, not with expectation, not with lingering hurt, but with a kind of distance that felt honest. Maybe he would call again. Maybe he wouldn't. Maybe, at some point, he would understand what had happened, or maybe he would only ever see it as something sudden, something unexplained. And that was all right, because I didn't need him to understand it for it to be valid. I didn't need anyone to confirm what I already knew. That was the difference now. For years, I had measured my place in the world through other people's recognition, through their responses, their presence, their acknowledgement. And when that recognition faded, I questioned myself instead of the situation. I adjusted. I gave more. I tried harder. But now, sitting there in the quiet glow of the room, I understood something that felt both simple and profound. I had never been the one who needed to change. I had only needed to stop ignoring what was already true. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, moving toward midnight without urgency. I didn't watch it closely. I didn't feel the need to mark the exact second 1 year turned into another. Time was already moving, with or without my attention. And for once, I wasn't trying to keep up with it or shape it into something meaningful. It already was. When midnight finally arrived, I didn't stand up. I didn't make a toast. I didn't say anything out loud. I simply sat there, breathing, present, aware. Enough. And in that quiet moment, I realized something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness in the loud, obvious sense, not excitement or relief, but something steadier. Belonging, not to a place, not to a role, but to myself. The house around me was still. The tree continued to glow softly. The candle flickered near the window. And I was no longer waiting for someone to walk through the door, because I was already where I needed to be, and for the first time in years, my life felt like it was truly mine.